started with that discussion right now. So I want to introduce two folks. One new friend of mine, Asma Uddin. She's a religious liberty lawyer. She has argued on behalf of multiple religious groups, including fellow evangelical Christians, before the United States Supreme Court. I recently got a chance to work with her a little bit more closely at the Aspen Institute in DC on a project she's working on there. She's the producer of a docuseries called The Secret Life of Muslims. Might be interesting, and has contributed to publications like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and also the Religion News Service, Teen Vogue. I'm glad she's here to speak. Suhail Khan is an older friend of mine. We've known each other for a number of years. He's the senior fellow for Christian Muslim Understanding at the Institute for Global Engagement. So when we speak about religious freedom tonight, we don't want to just confine that to America. Suhail has dealt with this and the religious rights of minority religions all over the world. He was a former senior counselor to President George W. Bush during the Bush White House. He's currently director of external affairs for Microsoft and a rabid fan of Johnny Cash, which makes me like him a lot. So I don't know if it would be a better joke to introduce it with one Christian and two Muslims, or one pastor and two lawyers. I'll let you guys figure that one out. But I want to get started with Asma. Tell us a little bit about the book you wrote. And I have it here. We were planning on giving away copies at the in-person, and we still have those, and we still will do that. Although if you want to go to Amazon and buy it tonight, I'm sure she wouldn't mind. It's called When Islam is Not a Religion. And we'll be talking more about this in October. But for tonight, Asma, tell us what inspired you to write this book. And within that, also a little bit more about your work and how you've advocated for religious freedom for all people.
Sure. Well, thank you, Joel, for having me here today. Thank you also for co-hosting this, and to Shahid and the American Muslim Institution for their work, and Adams and Harnessa's participation as well. And thank you to everyone who came out. And I hope more people will continue to join us. So Pastor Joel had said, he said the title of the book is When Islam is Not a Religion, but there's a subtitle after that, and that is Inside America's Fight for Religious Freedom. And I think that the coupling of those two parts of the title really kind of give you an idea of what it is that I'm concerned about and what I wrote about in this book. So the first part tells you that I'm obviously going to be talking a lot about attacks on Muslims, although that title is a little bit confusing, right? Like, when Islam is not a religion. But the second part tells you that I'm looking at this question not just as a question that's relevant to Muslims specifically, but as its connection to all Americans. And that's the perspective that I come from. So the pastor said, I have worked on religious freedom advocacy for people of every religion and of no religion. And the idea is, beyond the fact that that's just a good, right? To be able to be consistent and to have dignity in the work that we do. But it also comes from a place of understanding that in order to protect religious freedom for all of us, for even one of us, we have to protect it for all of us. There's inherent consistency that it's not just some sort of nice, philosophical statement or even an ethical point, but quite frankly, it is the way that the law works. It's just the nature of a jurisprudence. And so once you kind of create this precedent where you're carving out exceptions to this right for one group, guess what? The way the law works is that when you move on to the next case, it doesn't really matter what the specific religion was that the precedent was applied in. All that matters is, what did the court decide? And now once the court decided that, it can apply to any other religion and any other set of facts. And so I look at this in this book, where I'm like, look, there's like this increase in claim, right? There's like this idea that Islam is not a religion, that it is instead a political ideology. And the reason the people who are making this claim are making it is because they don't want Muslims to have religious freedom. The idea is that religious freedom is for people who are religious believers, who are adhering to something called a religion. And so if we say that Islam is not a religion, then that's going to cut out the, 3 to 7 million Muslims in America. And never mind this idea of depriving people of human rights. Doesn't seem kind of strange, even though the fact there's 1.8 billion Muslims across the world. And so that's what the book is about. I look at this, like, who is making this claim? Why are they making it? What are the legal ramifications, and how it impacts all Americans, and why we should all be worried about it?
Yeah. Wow. So basically what you're saying is if government can come for one of us, they can come for all of us.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. And so this is why we have to be, I did one of your earlier um, speeches that I watched, Asma, as well as I think it was chapter 10 in your book that really grabbed me personally, because I thought this is where it's at. There's the legal question that you talk about. If the government can do it to one, they can do it to all. Contrasted against that is I am less likely to sympathize with the religious rights of someone whose beliefs I don't personally share. That we're in a society now that the culture doesn't lend itself to allow us to do that. So I wonder if both of you, both Suhail and Asma, could address that for a minute. Number one, that sometimes religion does become political ideology. We know that Islam gets politicized in different places around the world. We also know that evangelical Christianity can be politicized. That neither one of those things delegitimizes the religion itself or the people who advocate it. But when those things happen, and I think this is what chapter 10 brought up to me, was it creates mistrust and fear, and therefore a propensity for me to either not care or maybe even be ambivalent or even antagonistic toward people who follow another religion and their rights. And I don't even realize that I'm digging my own grave when I do that.
Right. Well, what I think was really interesting is that those who kind of set out to make this distinction between a religion and what they're saying is a political ideology, it's like, well, where exactly does one end and the other start, right? And
Right.
the very process of trying to parse that is in itself often a violation of religious freedom, right? Because it's essentially saying, well, if it's spiritual and if it's happening within the confines of your house of worship or your house, it's okay, but don't bring it into the public space. And so one of the ironies that I look at is that oftentimes the people who are most vocal in making this argument against Muslims are the ones who are advocating for their religion to essentially be implemented into public policy or to have very public presence. So it's kind of like, well, wait a second, why isn't that political? And doesn't it occur to you that by saying that religion shouldn't have this public element, that somehow it's illegitimate? Don't you see that that's going to just come back to bite you?
Yeah, yeah. A civil, Os Guinness, who's an evangelical cultural influencer, talks about civil square, and that one necessary element to a civil square is you can't have one religion dictating how society is going to conduct itself. You got to figure out how to share the space. Suhail, you want to add to this? You got to unmute your mic there, buddy.
So thanks. So first, I want to join Haronisa and Asma in thanking you and Shahid, Pastor Joel, in organizing this. And yeah, I wish we were out in West Virginia with you all in person, but I'm glad we could do this virtually. But to answer the question, absolutely, each of us, our ideologies, whether they be political or otherwise, are formed by, a multiple number of forces, whether they be our parents, our faith, our experiences. Maybe there might be life events. I do a lot of work with American veterans, obviously. An experience serving our country, particularly overseas, can really inform your politics. And so that's why it's so important that we come back to the Constitution and the fact that there is a framework that our country is guided by. And what we're talking about today, our founders saw it to put right into the First Amendment of the Constitution, that the government, just as you said, Pastor Joel, cannot hold up one religion as being an official religion, but it can't also deny others, particularly religious minorities, of their rights. And that's the genius of the framers and the Constitution, and that they embedded that right in the First Amendment. Now, there are times where those rights might bump up against each other, where we might have some close calls, and we see those decisions being made by the courts and by legislators, both on the state and the federal level all the time. And we don't always get it right. Our history, unfortunately, has many moments where we didn't get it right. But I'll say one thing, that, to quote Winston Churchill, you can always count on Americans to do the right thing after they've exhausted all other possibilities. We eventually get it right. And that again, I attribute to not only the genius of the framers and the Constitution, but also the real heart that Americans have for fairness, for religious freedom, and for really treating the other as you want to treat yourself. And so that's where people like Asma, who have gone into the courts and fought for religious freedom, not only for one specific religious group, but for all, is so important that as Americans, we adhere not only to our personal ideologies or religious preferences, but to a principle, and that is that all people should enjoy religious freedom, the ability to express themselves, including in the public arena, as protected and guaranteed by our Constitution.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for putting that way, Suhail. And I think one of the things you mentioned is sometimes they do bump up against one another, and that always becomes a delicate discussion legally as well as culturally when someone's religious conviction begins to infringe on somebody else's space. Now what do you do? And then
Right.
that creates a lot of fear. And we